Queen Elizabeth II, the longest reigning monarch in British history. Over 65 years on the throne, yet hers is a reign that nearly didn't happen.
I think for Princess Elizabeth, the abdication must have been catastrophic.
Driven by duty,
My whole life shall be devoted to your service.
she's ruled over crisis and war
Our thoughts today are with those in the South Atlantic.
and dramatic social and technological change.
Television has made it possible for many of you to see me in your homes on Christmas Day.
She's seen over 12 prime ministers come and go.
The Queen has a very sharp mind.
She's endured the breakup of the empire and the creation of her beloved Commonwealth.
The Queen had an instinct
Of what the new Commonwealth was about.
Throughout it all, she's been a steadying presence. Yet the most famous woman in the world remains mysterious. This is the inside story, as told by her closest friends and advisors.
I think the Queen is basically a very shy person.
She's very humble, actually.
She's a wonderful mimic. I mean, she's really, really funny.
It's hard to imagine a world without her.
She has done her job bloody well.
Elizabeth, the wife, the mother, the Queen. The 1970s had been one of the Queen's most difficult periods on the throne. She'd weathered personal challenges with her sister's divorce and political wrangling over the state of her finances. But the 1980s saw the tables turn. It would be a decade defined by extraordinary highs, but not without its challenges.
Younger royals were becoming celebrities, and that wasn't their role at all. Their role was to support the Queen.
The standout highlight was the wedding of the Queen's eldest son, Prince Charles, to Lady Diana Spencer in July 1981. Close friends of the Queen remember her joy.
I think the Queen was delighted because, I mean, you know, he wasn't all that young, Prince Charles, you know, and it's quite difficult in those days to find somebody that, you know, from a good family like that.
I think the younger generation obviously got very excited with a beautiful young couple.
I think we all thought it was perfect. Just the right sort of person.
In all the pomp and circumstance, it's easy to forget this was more than a state occasion. One of the few times when the Queen's public role as monarch and private role as mother were seamlessly combined. It's something Stuart Purvis, one of the producers who masterminded the live broadcast of the wedding, got to see up close.
We flooded London with cameras, some of them inside St Paul's Cathedral, some out in the street. Not all of them got on the air, so I sold the network the idea of a Christmas special of the pictures you hadn't seen before. We called it A Wedding in a Family, and these are the shots, some of the shots that we picked out as being things that the viewer would not have seen before.
The resulting documentary was broadcast only once. It was buried away in the archives after its original transmission, and is being shown here for the first time in 35 years. It's a unique and moving insight into the Queen as monarch and mother.
I felt that on the day we'd seen at times quite a solemn Queen, and it just was the way that it turned out. But when you went back and looked at the footage in more detail, you did see these moments where she was just absolutely enjoying the day. She was really relaxed and really happy.
With this ring, I thee wed.
I thee wed.
You began to see that the Queen could enjoy both, if you like, the ceremonial part of it, but also the family part of it.
One moment missed by the live broadcast reveals how the Queen was touched by a gesture of affection between her son and his bride.
The princess appears to kind of slip her hand in with her husband, kind of joining them together. Probably she was nervous at the moment. That reaction from the Queen, I love that sort of smile of recognition that she spotted what's happened.
And she saw what the camera didn't. The exuberant choirmaster, quite carried away, knocking over one of the choir's lampshades. It took quite a bit not to be caught laughing.
The Queen spotted it, and you could see her trying to sort of fight back the smile as presumably the lampshade lay in front of her.
As everyone could see, there was one lamp without a shade when the speaker got up to read the lesson.
Very, very human moment, reminding us that this is the bridegroom's mother as much as the Queen of the country.
Spontaneous moments like this give us some insight into what the Queen's really like. One of her most trusted advisors in the 1980s was Sir William Heseltine. As a former private secretary, he's been at her side in good times and bad. He's speaking for the first time in a British TV series about his relationship with the Queen. He remembers how she went out of her way to fulfill the lifelong wish of a Commonwealth servant that wedding weekend.
From the time the Queen first visited Tonga, through the 60s, 70s, there had been a local, much loved member of the Tongan entourage by members of the household, because at a Tongan feast the usual drink offered was coconut juice or something, but Molly would appear from round behind a tree with a tray saying, "Gin and tonic."
When the royal wedding was announced, Molly wrote to Sir William asking if it might be possible to serve at the palace during this special event.
And so I spoke to my colleague, the then master of the household, and said, could you use Molly? So he said, under no circumstances, I don't want strange people coming in. I've got my own staff who know what to do. Anyhow, I took a mean advantage of him, and I said to the Queen that Molly had written me this letter wanting to come, and she said, of course he must come.
Molly served drinks at a formal party the night before the wedding. Much to his delight, it was him, and not the waiting dignitaries, that the Queen sought out when she arrived.
The Queen came through the door, and the first person she saw was Molly. And so, forgetting about everybody else, she walked up to him and said, hello, Molly, how are you? And so his life was made from that point on.
The early years of the 80s were defined by huge affection and regard for the Queen and the monarchy. But the decade would not be without its challenges, especially in the political sphere, as it saw the Queen come into close contact with another powerful woman, Margaret Thatcher. By the 1980s, the Queen had been on the throne for over 30 years. Her sense of duty, which had been a guiding principle since the beginning of her reign, remained as strong and dedicated as ever.
Even her weekends were not her own, because on Saturday mornings, one of the private secretaries was in the office to pack up a red box which went up to Windsor. They tended to empty their desks on Friday for anything that needed attention by the Queen, and had them back on their desks on Monday morning, which was pretty efficient.
This attention to detail and dedication extended to her duties outside Britain too. It's something Sir Sonny Ramphal, who was Secretary-General of the Commonwealth and worked with her for over 15 years, experienced firsthand.
As head of the Commonwealth, the Queen is a worker.
During the Queen's reign, the Commonwealth became a more diverse and multicultural entity. Its endurance is something she cares deeply about. She's always taken the time to know the issues facing each country and discuss them thoroughly with their leaders.
The Queen talked with them about their problems, and she knew about their problems.
But in 1979, this community the Queen cares so deeply about was on the brink of collapse. On July 27th, the Queen flew to Lusaka, Zambia, 4 days before the start of a crucial Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting. It was an attempt to smooth over a brewing conflict between the African Commonwealth nations and her own British Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher.
The background to the Lusaka conference were the moves inside Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, which had led to the establishment of a black moderate government under Bishop Abel Muzorewa, but it was strongly believed that the Rhodesian former Prime Minister Ian Smith was behind the scenes, kind of pulling the strings.
Ian Smith had been Prime Minister of Rhodesia under the old white regime. Many felt he was the real power behind the new black leader, Bishop Muzorewa.
I think the expectation was that Margaret Thatcher would be stubborn and reflect a predominantly white sentiment at home.
African Commonwealth nations were worried that Margaret Thatcher would endorse what appeared to be a black majority government in name only. Thatcher, the Queen's 8th Prime Minister, had been elected just a few months before the conference. Her apparent lack of commitment to true black majority rule put her at odds with the Queen.
From my conversations with the Queen, not conversations in which we talked about Margaret Thatcher's policies, but about how important it was that the Commonwealth should not be the old white dominions. To that extent, they were not on the same page.
The Queen realised if she didn't somehow intervene to ease tensions between Margaret Thatcher and the African member nations, the conference could descend into chaos. She decided to broach the subject with Zambian President Kenneth Kaunda, who was hosting the conference.
It was her private presence at the conference and the quiet word that apparently she had in the back of the official car from the airport with President Kaunda, encouraging him to be supportive of Mrs. Thatcher's presence and not to attack her in open session. So there was the validity of her presence, but also a quiet, queenly word.
Her strategy had the desired effect. Despite expectations, Mrs. Thatcher and the leaders of the Commonwealth managed to resolve their differences.
The aim is to bring Rhodesia to legal independence on a basis which the Commonwealth and the international community as a whole will find acceptable.
Despite the favourable outcome, the conference raised an interesting question. How would the relationship between the Queen and Mrs. Thatcher develop?
I think that Mrs. Thatcher greatly appreciated the way the Queen helped to concert these occasions, but I also think that she resented, in a certain sense, the presence of the Queen because it reined her in saying what she felt needed to be said, and so I think there was a sense of being inhibited.
I think in some way the Queen and Mrs. Thatcher were quite similar. They were both hard-working, conscientious people, and in Mrs. Thatcher's case, she was always early for her audiences, not wanting to keep the Queen waiting.
Hints as to the nature of the relationship were evident from those early audiences.
Good evening, Your Majesty.
You've had a very long...
Mrs. Thatcher would, in a rather starchy way, sort of recite what the next bit of the parliamentary programme was, or, you know, what was going on at some summit, rather than having a sort of easy conversation.
Before the Prime Minister left the palace, she would come down panting for a glass of whiskey, which we were able to provide. And we would then get from her some account of the meeting. And this, in my case, was supplemented by a meeting with the Queen the following morning, in which I'd get her account of the audience. And these records are in the Royal Archives and probably not to be disturbed for a good many years.
Lord Butler was Mrs. Thatcher's principal private secretary in the early 80s and one of her closest political confidants.
Mrs. Thatcher was always in awe of the Queen. She could never relax with her. Like a lot of very assertive people, she was lacking in confidence, and in particular in her relations with the Queen.
It was on visits to Balmoral that the differences between the Queen and her Prime Minister were most pronounced. These annual prime ministerial visits are a necessary part of royal protocol. Lord Butler attended one of these trips with Mrs. Thatcher.
One of the events at Balmoral was a barbecue, which the Queen and Prince Philip gave. And this was an informal family party. There were no servants. Prince Philip did the cooking, and the Queen handed round the plates.
It's one of the rare occasions on which the Queen gets to roll up her sleeves. And according to Lady Butter, a ritual she thoroughly enjoys.
Absolutely, yes. Lays the table. And she doesn't like, obviously, you know, you have a method how you do things. You don't have people mess you up if they do it the wrong way. So it's much better for that not to happen.
But Mrs. Thatcher struggled with the informality of the occasion.
Mrs. Thatcher simply couldn't stand it. She couldn't stand being waited on by the Queen. And so she would keep leaping up and trying to intervene. She forgot that she was a guest and the Queen was the host. But she couldn't bring herself to accept her meal being given to her by the Queen.
I think the Queen was heard to whisper at one point, can't someone tell that woman to sit down? And you can see the sort of entirely unintended tension between the two.
I guess that, the Queen would have wished that Mrs. Thatcher could have been more relaxed and would have liked to have made her so. But I think that would have been an uphill job.
However awkward their personal interactions, the Queen and Mrs. Thatcher would need to establish a constructive working relationship. The next test of this relationship came in April 1982. The British Falkland Islands were invaded by Argentinian forces, plunging Britain into a major political crisis.
Argentina's flag flies over what was only hours before the residence of the British governor.
Margaret Thatcher responded swiftly, sending a task force to retake the islands, some 8,000 miles away in the South Atlantic.
I think the distinction between Prime Minister and Sovereign, between those two women at that point, is fundamentally just the distinction of their natural role. Mrs. Thatcher had to fight this thing and win it, and the Queen had to help make people feel that it would be all right.
For the Queen, the Falklands invasion was more than a matter of sovereignty. It was personal. Prince Andrew was serving as a helicopter pilot with the British Navy. He was stationed on HMS Invincible, one of the ships destined to play a key role in the conflict. And he had no intention of letting it sail without him.
I think the Queen wanted him to be able to, and fundamentally Mrs. Thatcher didn't want him to, because she was just frightened of the danger. What happens if? She never admitted to that in public because that would seem as if she was sort of undermining them, but she accepted that Prince Andrew wanted to fight, and in the end he did, but this was a sort of something that worried her.
During those tense months in 1982, the knowledge the Queen's own son was involved resonated deeply with the public, and her support for those caught up in the conflict managed to unify the country.
Before I begin, I would like to say one thing. Our thoughts today are with those who are in the South Atlantic, and our prayers are for their success and a safe return to their homes and loved ones.
Success in the South Atlantic was far from certain. Great Britain had few friends among Latin American nations and needed the support of a major power to strengthen its hand.
The American attitude was somewhat ambiguous. And this annoyed Mrs. Thatcher because she was a great friend of Ronald Reagan and she expected 100% support.
The US Defense Department provided weapons and intelligence, but public support from the president was sorely lacking. It was the middle of the Cold War, and key American aides wanted to prevent any threat posed by South American communists.
There were definitely people in the US administration who were saying, don't give Britain all this stuff. It's more important to us to make sure we don't have communists in our back door in Latin America.
But despite resistance from inside the White House, President Reagan accepted a formal invitation from the Queen to visit Great Britain.
There was, of course, a danger if you're in the middle of a war that this couldn't take place. It might be considered too controversial, too difficult.
Inviting President Reagan and his wife to stay at the Royal Castle at Windsor was a masterstroke.
He describes it in his diary as a fairy tale experience. He was really starstruck. It was wonderful.
And one of the sort of ironies of history is that here's this, the most important country in the world, the United States, that deliberately threw off the British monarchy. But no one likes going to the palace more than the US president. Certainly appealed to Ronald Reagan, who had a sort of filmic idea of history.
The highlight of the trip, captured on camera, was a ride with the Queen through the Windsor estate.
He's a keen rider. He's keener than she is at talking to the press, doing the usual presidential exchange with the media, where she's sort of saying, come on, let's go ride, is what it amounts to.
The timing of this expertly choreographed visit with the Queen was perfect, and it swayed the pendulum in Britain's favour.
I think it was a contributing factor in President Reagan's mind, and he's thinking, which way will the blade lie in this? Will it lie to Argentina or will it lie to Britain? And one factor in it is the overall feeling of friendship between the monarchy and the president.
The next day, the president addressed Parliament, pledging his unequivocal support for British forces in the Falklands.
Voices have been raised protesting their sacrifice for lumps of rock and earth so far away. But those young men aren't fighting for mere real estate. They fight for a cause, for the belief that armed aggression must not be allowed to succeed and the people must participate in the decisions of government.
6 days later, Port Stanley was liberated and the sovereignty of the islands restored. It was one of Margaret Thatcher's proudest achievements, and her written accounts reveal the excitement of delivering news of the victory to the Queen.
She hardly ever wrote a private account of anything, but she wrote a private account of the Falklands War. And she says something like, it was such a thrill to be able to tell her that one of her islands was restored to her.
In the aftermath of the conflict, many accused Mrs. Thatcher of grand behaviour and attempting to upstage the Queen. And a Thanksgiving ceremony to mark the end of the war in July threatened to put them in an awkward situation once again.
She understood that the Prime Minister is not the big person on this occasion. So she particularly asked that she did not get seated in an important position. Who's the star? Is it this woman, the Queen, or that woman, Margaret Thatcher? Because she's conscious of there's been two women in a very male environment.
Mrs. Thatcher would never have competed with the Queen. And on the whole, I think both at the palace end and at the government end, if it was could be avoided that the Queen and Mrs. Thatcher appeared at the same events, they did avoid it.
Those close to the Queen say the relationship was always somewhat strained.
My observation was that the Queen certainly had some prime ministers with whom she enjoyed a greater degree of warmth, but the relationship with Mrs. Thatcher was always a very proper one.
The Queen navigated the political challenges of the early 80s with skill and confidence. Even her awkward relationship with Margaret Thatcher appeared to be working effectively. But one explosive event in 1986 threatened to shatter it. The Queen is arguably the most famous woman in the world, her every move scrutinized and analyzed. Yet despite this constant attention, she's always managed to remain calm and in control.
I've often wondered to myself how the history books would describe her. And Elizabeth the Steadfast, I think, is the one that came instantly to my mind. She's such a steady, solid person.
Sir William Heseltine remembers one day in June 1981 when this steadiness was tested. The Queen was taking part in the trooping of colour, riding her favourite horse Burmese alongside members of the household cavalry.
I was on duty at Buckingham Palace in the office on that day. None of us private secretaries were involved in the actual ceremony.
The Queen had made it down the Mall, with Horse Guards parade in sight when shots were fired. The moment was captured on camera and broadcast live.
She brought the horse under control and continued her ride down to Horse Guards, and the ceremony went ahead exactly as planned.
The shots fired were blanks, dispatched by a teenage gunman, but no one, including the Queen, knew that at the time.
I think that the Queen, and actually many monarchs, do realise that assassination is really the ultimate occupational hazard. And the Queen has never wanted to be hidden away behind dark glass cars and bulletproof cars and so forth.
She was, as always, extremely calm and told me exactly what had happened and how well her horse had behaved. So her composure was quite remarkable.
The Queen's unflappable response was of little surprise to those who knew her well. But one event in 1986 threatened to puncture this calm resolve. It brought her awkward relationship with Margaret Thatcher into the full glare of the media yet again. The Queen had spent over 30 years staying out of party politics. But in July, the Sunday Times ran an article claiming there were deep political divisions between the Queen and Mrs. Thatcher. It caused an uproar.
The Queen didn't want anything like this published. She had always prized being above party politics, of nobody knowing what her political views are, of really playing the game exactly as a monarch in a parliamentary democracy should.
It was a sensational coup that seemingly revealed the Queen's politics for the first time. The newspaper's editor, Andrew Neil, wanted to be sure the claims were true.
My first reaction was that we couldn't publish it unless we were sure. So I did interrogate the journalist who had written it. He had come back saying that the rift, the gulf between the Queen and Margaret Thatcher was much wider than an argument about the Commonwealth and South African sanctions and apartheid. The Queen, we had been told, was unhappy at the social tensions and unrest during the miners' strike, that she thought Mrs. Thatcher was too, quote, uncaring for the less fortunate in society. So this had become a much bigger story. This wasn't a specific issue. This was now the broad thrust of Thatcherism, of Thatcherite policies.
But perhaps the most extraordinary feature of the story was that its source was a palace insider.
When ITN came to interview me that night, that Saturday night, as the story was coming off the presses, they said, the palace is not denying this story, you know. And I thought to myself, well, how could it? Because the palace is behind it.
The sources that we're talking about are far too important and responsible in their positions in the palace to want to fabricate or be mischievous on something like this.
It appeared as if the Times had an unprecedented coup on their hands. Evidence of the Queen's opinions, something she'd been at pains never to share. For the palace, the timing of the story couldn't have been worse.
Well, it came at a very bad time. It was the week in which Prince Andrew was to be married, and so all our attention really was focused elsewhere.
The Queen was away from Buckingham Palace, and Sir William Heseltine had to break the news of the brewing controversy over the phone.
She was obviously taken aback as I was, and the relationship between the Queen and the Prime Minister is of paramount importance for us all. And so she was disturbed by it. And we thought it would be a very good idea if she herself got on the telephone and spoke to Mrs. Thatcher, which was what happened.
Mrs. Thatcher was very correct about it all, accepted all this courteously, didn't create any row. But she did gradually learn from one or two sources that it was an accurate representation of what the paper had been told.
In the days that followed, the identity of the source was revealed as Michael Shea, the Queen's very own press secretary.
He was the voice of the Queen. If you wanted to know what was happening in the palace or what the Queen was doing, Michael Shea was the top guy to go to.
I don't know if the Queen authorized these advisors to do this or if she was informed that this was what was being done. All I can say is that in the 48 hours of the run-up to the publishing of this story, these senior advisors were kept fully informed of what we intended to do.
So much were the palace's fingerprints all over this that we had read back huge chunks of the story to Michael Shea, and he had corrected things that we had got wrong.
Michael Shea, an ex-diplomat, had been the Queen's key press secretary for 8 years.
If Michael Shea felt he enjoyed a good working relationship with the royal family, it would seem that his sentiments were heartily reciprocated. Mr. Shea stood accused of trying to corral the heads of government into line. Someone felt he was being too helpful.
Many who encountered Michael Shea during his time as the Queen's press secretary felt he had an inflated sense of his position.
Michael Shea had a pretty high opinion of himself as the Queen's press secretary. When the Queen visited China, he was out there fighting for camera positions for the British press. He was a kind of frontline press secretary. I think, to be honest, he became overconfident. He kind of a man who was almost riding for a fall.
For the Queen and her most trusted courtiers, Shea's involvement in the story came as a shock.
It wasn't for some days after the event that I eventually discovered that it was Michael Shea's briefing on which they had based the whole story, nothing else. And Shea kept denying that anything he had said could have borne this interpretation.
William Heseltine, as private secretary, was the Queen's most senior advisor and Michael Shea's superior. He made the unprecedented decision to address the claims in a public letter to the Times.
I resolved it to some extent, as people may remember, by writing a letter to the Times in which I set out the constitutional position and privileges of the Queen, pointed out that she'd been an absolutely impeccable constitutional monarch, and it was infinitely improbable that she would suddenly have taken leave of her senses and breached them in such a way as to suggest that she was out of sympathy with her Prime Minister.
His letter conceded that Michael Shea was indeed the key source of the story, but accused the Sunday Times of being liberal with the truth.
Probably the lowest point for me personally in the whole story, because until then we had been batting back, but as the editor of the Times said, this is unprecedented. This letter could not have been written without the Queen's support and authority.
Mr. Shea, have you anything to say about the article in the Sunday Times?
No, absolutely nothing.
Michael Shea was certainly in no position to offer a view of the Queen's opinions on these matters, and had assured me that he'd not done so. I had to say I came to doubt that assurance somewhat, because the views which appeared in the papers were, I think, very much more those of Michael Shea than the Queen's.
We'll never know exactly what he said to the Sunday Times about the relationship between the Prime Minister and the Queen, but he probably went a bit further than he should have done. And then the Sunday Times probably took it a bit further than that. He couldn't find a way of reining it back, and then the balloon went up.
It was little surprise then that within the year, Michael Shea quietly left the palace.
He had become, at that time, the victim of hubris. And I think he was carried away by a sense of his own self-importance. I think he gave them enough of a lead to write the story as they did.
Although little was said in public at the time, the story greatly upset both the Queen and Mrs. Thatcher.
She was absolutely devastated by it. She was cut to the quick. Because the last thing that she would have wanted was for the public to believe that she had fallen out with the Queen or even offended the Queen in some way. It hurt her very deeply.
The Queen, meanwhile, stoic and steady in public, showed a different side behind closed doors. Princess Josephine Lowenstein, an old friend of Princess Margaret, remembers a revealing story shared by the Queen's sister.
She said, I've only seen my sister cry once. And she said it was when the press put all the articles about her not getting on with Mrs. Thatcher. That they were daggers drawn, that they hated each other. It was absolutely untrue. So that's the only time I've ever seen her cry.
The Queen and Mrs. Thatcher's relationship survived the controversy, and they continued to work together until the end of her premiership. It was a hiccup in what was a largely successful decade for the Queen. But one event involving her children would herald a tumultuous new period for the monarchy. In many ways, the 1980s were a golden era for the Queen and the monarchy. The Queen's children got married to the delight of the public, and she settled into her role as grandmother. Lady Glenconner got a chance to see this private side of the Queen up close.
I once spent a week at Balmoral. I was sort of looking after Princess Margaret, and I rarely saw her. I mean, she's wonderful with the children.
Amidst all the public attention and adoration, the Queen had been quietly supporting those dearest to her through challenging personal times. Lady Butter recalls one unforgettable event in 1979 in which the Queen had rallied around those she loved. The Queen's cousin, Lord Mountbatten, was holidaying with his family in the Irish Republic. It was August, and Lady Butter's son was also staying with the Mountbattens.
They were all having a lovely, happy time, all the children. And my son actually rang up and said, "Do you think it'd be very rude if I came back for the bank holiday, if I left the bank holiday?" I said, "I'm sure not. No, because his sisters were here and people were coming."
Lady Butter's son had a lucky escape. On the morning of August the 27th, Lord Mountbatten was killed on his boat Shadow 5 by an IRA bomb. 3 members of the family were injured, but the Dowager Lady Brabourne, Lord Mountbatten's grandson Nick, and a local boy working on the boat were killed.
Awful. Awful. You see, it gets me now. Terrible.
The Queen had immediately stepped in to help. Sir William Heseltine observed how dedicated she was to her grieving relatives.
The Queen's reaction had been to gather the survivors of that event and ask them to come up and stay at Balmoral.
They arrived rather late, and they thought she would have gone to bed, but she was absolutely up and waiting to greet them and virtually helping them to unpack their suitcases.
They were all very much helped and propped up by the support which the Queen gave them.
This nurturing side of the Queen was most often carried out in private. In 1980, one prospective new member of the royal family had been on the receiving end, Lady Diana Spencer. From the moment the press learned of her relationship with Prince Charles, Diana had been pursued relentlessly.
The Queen tried very hard to protect her, particularly when there was so much interest by the press, and almost sort of to the extinction of Prince Charles, because they just loved her.
It might surprise people now, but at the beginning of her courtship with Prince Charles, Diana was the absolute model of discretion. The fact that the girl kept stumm and that she behaved so gracefully under press pressure made the Queen confident that she would be the right person for the job.
But in the months following the marriage, it had become clear Diana was struggling.
As early as September, when Diana had some emotional episodes, tantrums in Balmoral, it was the Queen who intervened and arranged for her to go down to London and see at least one specialist there to help calm her down.
The Queen was certain the incessant attention of the press was the cause of the princess's distress. Her response was remarkable. For the first time in history, Fleet Street editors were invited to the palace for a private audience with the Queen.
She explained the problem of this new young recruit to the family and the enormous pressure that she was under. One of the editors responded rather robustly and said, well, if she goes out in the street, she's fair game. And the Queen replied, well, that's a very pompous remark.
The appeal was made by both Michael Shea and by the Queen herself to lay off on Diana, but it didn't really have much effect.
Sir William Heseltine was one of those within the royal household who Diana trusted and turned to for advice.
I always used to say to Diana when she was expounding her problems to me, well, why don't you go and talk to the Queen about it? I'm not in a position to be able to help you much, but...
And why didn't she, do you think? Or did she?
Not as much as she might have done, I think. I'm sure it wasn't because she was made unwelcome when she went. But I suppose they became, anyway, so delicate, and it was very awkward to go and complain to the Queen about her son, I imagine.
I think the Queen did try and support her. I mean, she wasn't easy as a person. She had so many qualities, but she was a little difficult.
But after almost a decade of royal popularity and unstinting affection, something was changing. The Queen's children had become celebrities, and their lives obsessively followed like a real-life soap opera.
The problem was that in many ways the royal family was becoming complicit in this soap opera, as the media wanted more and more of this soap opera, and they wanted it to go wrong as well.
Whatever her private feelings, the Queen rarely intervened to curtail or contain her own children. One event in 1987 brought the Queen's relationship with her children and its frailties into sharp focus.
She's never been very good at saying no to her children. And so when Edward came up with his proposals for a media career, the Queen went with it.
Edward kicked off this career with the pitch to make a royal-themed version of the popular BBC game show, It's a Knockout. But the Queen's closest advisors were kept in the dark.
It was only when it was well set up and on the way to being organised that I first heard about it. And I tried to persuade the Queen that it was such a bad idea that she ought to call it off.
But the event wasn't called off. For programme makers, it was a tantalising opportunity.
If William, Kate and Harry phoned ITV tomorrow and said they wanted to do a special royal edition of I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here, ITV would be doing cartwheels down the street. And, of course, the BBC were back then.
The royal version had the young royals dressed as Tudor courtiers and captaining teams of celebrities. Tony Nicholson, a young producer who worked on the event, got an intriguing insight into the young royals' competitive nature.
Prince Andrew said something that Princess Anne took exception to, and she just slapped him down and said, "Now you listen here, my lad." And I thought, this is a side of the royal family not many people get to see.
The press reaction was scathing. They deemed the whole affair a huge embarrassment to the Queen and her family.
The Sunday Times did cover it as a royal knockout at the time, and we weren't very complimentary. It was a harbinger of bad times to come for the monarchy.
The programme was such an embarrassment to the royals, it hasn't been shown since. The reaction of Prince Edward after the games made a bad situation even worse.
I know the captains have enjoyed themselves. I only hope that you've enjoyed yourselves. Have you? Well, thanks for sounding so bloody enthusiastic. What have you been doing in here all day? Have you been watching it? Yeah. What did you think of it?
The newspapers the next morning were splashed with headlines branding the prince childish and petulant. Those close to the Queen recognised it as a PR disaster.
Well, I was rather reluctant to talk to her about it. Afterwards, I ended up trying to persuade her to intervene, and unsuccessfully. But I'm sure she couldn't have been very pleased. Nobody could have been pleased with the press reaction that followed.
It was a moment of hubris for the royal family after a decade of unparalleled popularity. And it marked the beginning of a change in the public's relationship with the Queen and her children.
When you talk about the possibility of having let daylight in on the magic, this did more damage, I think, than almost anything that happened in my time.
In many ways, the 80s had been a golden age for the Queen and her family. There were weddings, births, and moments of national celebration. But by the end of the decade, the tide was turning. There was a growing disenchantment with the royals and their celebrity lifestyles.
The Queen did what she always does best. She carried on.
The Queen and the monarchy bore the brunt of this disaffection, making the 90s her most challenging decade yet. 1992 marked the Queen's 40th year on the throne, but what should have been a time of celebration became marked by disaster.
In the words of one of my more sympathetic correspondents, it has turned out to be an annus horribilis.
Days before her now infamous speech, a devastating fire had ripped through the Queen's castle at Windsor.
A scene of chaos and destruction. This castle, dating back to the 9th century and which survived the wartime blitz, now struck at its very heart.
The Queen's close friend, Lady Penn, knew just what a blow it would be.
Windsor's her home. It must have been awful for her to see it on fire like that. Terrible.
The Queen was at Windsor as the fire raged, but with the Duke of Edinburgh away on official engagement, she had to oversee efforts to save the castle without his support.
She wanted to take out, whilst it was still safe to do so, those small things that were of great value to her. So she was actually actively involved in going into rooms that were very smoky.
The Queen walked away disconsolate. She could shake away the wet, but not her worries.
This diminutive figure of the monarch in her raincoat with the hood on was something very touching and rather moving to people.
When she returned to Buckingham Palace that evening, her press secretary, Charles Anson, was there to meet her.
She had a very heavy cold already and clearly was looking quite tired. She just shrugged her shoulders and said, it was ghastly, but at least we managed to save the pictures. It's a very British answer. Her spirit was not broken in any way at all.
In the aftermath, the Heritage Secretary Peter Brook announced the money for the restoration would come from the public purse.
Resources will be provided to restore this most precious and well-loved part of our national heritage.
I think he just assumed that the public would want to see the castle restored, and that the public would expect that that was something that would fall on the public purse.
But Britain was in the midst of a crippling recession, and the recent marital problems of her children had severely dented the popularity of the Queen. The public had no intention of paying.
We had reached a point, I think, in November '92, where the febrile mood of people was very strong on anything to do with the royal family.
It was a testing time as the Queen and her advisors attempted to ride the wave of negative public opinion.
Publicity was horrific, but out of that discussion about how to deal with the restoration and how to pay for it came a set of initiatives that were actually a great benefit to the monarchy.
In what some viewed as a radical solution, the Queen opened Buckingham Palace to the public as a way of paying for the restoration.
This was a good example of change, of reform, of open-mindedness, of a willingness to do things in a different way. And I think that sense of a new purpose saw its way into quite a lot of other initiatives during the 1990s.
Moves to modernize the palace and make the monarchy more transparent had been underway for some time before the fire. Sir William Heseltine, a former private secretary to the Queen, had been working on these changes since the early 80s. He knew it was vital that the Queen be seen to pay her way.
It all really turned on money. And one of the things which was under consideration then, but which didn't happen until after the fire at Windsor, was whether the Queen should pay tax.
It wasn't the first time the Queen had come under pressure to pay tax. In the 1970s, with the country in economic turmoil, there were demands that she cull the civil list and pay tax on her private income. But the Queen had battled hard to resist it.
She really fought a pretty fierce rearguard action. The Queen Mother was very proud of the way in which George VI had got through a whole reign without any income tax or, more important, inheritance tax on those big country estates. Inheritance tax would wipe those out. And she was very strict with the Queen about never giving way.
And 20 years later, persuading the Queen of the need to pay tax remained tricky.
I think her father had left her with the view that this concession had been hardly won and should be hardly dispensed with.
With the nation up in arms at the prospect of paying for this costly restoration, the Queen had no choice but to give in. It was a sensible move and went some way to appease the hostile public mood.
I think it was a good decision, and I think it did have the effect of removing a sore from relations with the public.
Events at home in 1992 would be a precursor to the difficult decade ahead. There would be challenges abroad too, as the Queen paid royal visits to a former communist and an anti-monarchist. In the early 90s, the Queen's popularity at home was low, and the monarchy heavily criticised. And there was to be no let-up. As she embarked on a series of sensitive foreign trips, she would call on all her years of experience. In February 1992, she travelled to Australia. She'd been all over the country on her first post-coronation tour in 1954, and it had remained close to her heart.
I find, as do the most hardened of travellers, that a visit to Sydney still lifts the spirits with its beauty and the warmth of its welcome.
But the newly elected Prime Minister, Paul Keating, had big changes in mind. He wanted to cut all ties with the monarchy.
Keating always, in his heart, harboured the idea of an Australian republic. And once Keating became Prime Minister, it was Keating who forced open the window and said, "We're going to do it."
And Keating was consistently outspoken about his desire to make Australia independent from Great Britain.
Just as Great Britain some time ago sought to make her future secure in the European community. So Australia now vigorously seeks partnership with countries in our own region.
I have a vivid memory of that visit to Australia that, certainly in media terms, that they wanted to portray this visit as a confrontation between the Royalists and the Republicans.
Keating, as the champion of the Republican cause, became a target for the tabloid press in Britain. It started as soon as the Queen touched down in Australia.
As the Queen walked down the steps of the aircraft, she greeted the Prime Minister and his wife, who is Dutch, and she didn't curtsy. And immediately the press said, look, this is another sign of the Keating family's rude behaviour in front of the Queen.
The Queen represented everything the Republican Keating wanted to dismantle in his bid to make Australia a modern nation. But the relationship that developed was something of a surprise. Keating has vivid memories of his interactions with the Queen.
There was a lightness about her, if she was allowed to be light. If I think the events and the Prime Minister were very formal, then she closed up and became formal too. But if she was encouraged to be lighter, she would be lighter.
And they bonded over an unlikely common interest.
The Queen or a member of the royal family wouldn't expect a Labor Prime Minister, of all people, to have an intimate knowledge of the English Regency. I referred to particular pieces of objet d'art she had in the royal collection and said to her, well, I have similar things by the same makers. On one thing she said, I should have that. I said, ma'am, will you get that big checkbook of yours out? And you can have it.
But over the course of the visit, the press insisted on painting Keating's behaviour as inappropriate. At a packed reception in the Australian Parliament building, he was accused of manhandling the Queen.
I was trying to encourage the Queen to people I knew she knew. And this is where some photographer snapped me with my arm around her.
It was a perfectly instinctive gesture, but the press, of course, had it immediately as not a pat on the back, but probably a pat on the backside or whatever it was.
According to Keating, the Queen was anxious about how his gesture was willfully misinterpreted by the press.
The then Governor-General, Bill Hayden, had told me the Queen came to his office very stressful, he said, about the reports in the London media, saying they're completely fictitious and wrong, and that she sort of offered her apologies about the behaviour of the press.
But their personal warmth didn't prevent Keating from delivering bad news. The following year, he visited the Queen at Balmoral and informed her of his intention to make Australia a republic.
I admired the fact she met me alone, because I'm coming with a message that she had encountered in a number of countries which had become republics within the Commonwealth. She was very proper. She understood the weights. And what more could I ask for?
Although they were ideologically on different sides of the argument, the Queen never held a grudge. In fact, Keating remembers their encounters as surprisingly candid.
She was very, very open and frank in her dealings with me about her family, about the sort of way she saw the world. Now, whether she adopted that policy with other prime ministers, I can, of course, can never know.
Although Keating lost power in 1996, the Republican drive he ignited would dominate the rest of the decade. It culminated in a nail-biting referendum in 1999, in which the people voted against a republic. Today, the Queen is still sovereign in Australia. In 1994, the Queen would embark on yet another challenging and sensitive foreign trip. The Soviet Union had disbanded just 3 years earlier, and this was the first ever visit to Russia by a British monarch.
The Queen had not visited any of former communist Eastern Europe, and this visit to Moscow at this time in the early 90s was a very important one symbolically.
But this was also a trip with great personal importance for the Queen. Her grandfather, King George V, and the last Russian Tsar, Nicholas II, were first cousins. His assassination after the 1917 revolution, and that of his wife and children, had devastated her grandfather and left a lasting memory. Hugo Vickers was on the historic tour and recalls a memorable first night at the ballet in Moscow.
There she was in a box which had once been the Tsar's box. And she was there, with Yeltsin and his wife and watching this performance. But there was also a hammer and sickle, very prominently on the box.
The Queen's host, President Boris Yeltsin, had a bullish reputation. A former communist, ideologically opposed to the monarchy, he was unpredictable and flamboyant. Yet he was taken with the Queen from the moment they met.
Mr. President, you and I have spent most of our lives believing that this evening could never happen. I hope that you are as delighted as I am to be proved wrong.
Over the course of the visit, Yeltsin confided in the Queen, one of the only world leaders he could be unguarded with about his political concerns.
Boris Yeltsin felt able to talk very frankly about the difficulties that he faced in Russia and feel very easy about talking frankly to her because she will never break a confidence, and in 65 years it's never happened.
Admiral Robert Woodard, who was then captain of the Royal Yacht Britannia, sailed to St. Petersburg to meet the Queen and take her home.
Her Majesty, without a doubt, admired him. She had expressed how enormous Russia was and how complicated it was, and that it took someone like that to rule it.
On the final night of the trip, the Queen hosted a banquet on board Britannia to thank the President.
Before the dinner, it was requested that perhaps she might not have her normal martini, because Mr. Yeltsin would almost certainly ask for exactly what she was drinking, and they didn't want to sort of set him alight too early.
After the dinner, the Queen raised a toast to Russia. It prompted a rather dramatic response from the President.
Suddenly, there was the most enormous explosion. And there was Mr. Yeltsin standing with debris all round him because he had no gavel. He'd brought his fist down on the table. An enormous crash. And everybody... And he then spoke in Russian for 20 minutes, which no one understood.
President Yeltsin's impromptu speech threw the tightly timed departure of the yacht awry, but led to a touching farewell.
He burst into tears, leaving the yacht. There was no doubt that the Queen was jolly moved too. And he was reluctant to leave at the end. It was very touching, really.
But the most momentous trip of the whole decade would come the following year. The Queen returned to South Africa for the first time in nearly 50 years. It was a place with great personal significance. She'd visited as a young princess in 1947. It was an experience that set the purpose of her entire reign, a devotion to the Commonwealth and all it represented.
I declare before you all that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service and to the service of our great imperial family to which we all belong.
The year after the Queen's iconic speech, the National Party ushered in an era of rule known as apartheid, in which policies of racial segregation became law. South Africa would later leave the Commonwealth to avoid expulsion for their racially biased policies. But the election of Nelson Mandela as president in 1994 brought new hope.
Never, never, and never again shall it be that this beautiful land will again experience the oppression of one by another.
Mandela had spent 27 years in prison for attempting to overthrow the apartheid state. But now, under his leadership, South Africa was free of apartheid and back in the Commonwealth.
The triumph of Nelson Mandela's election, I can't quantify how important that was to the Commonwealth.
The return of South Africa to the Commonwealth was a huge moment for the Queen. The Commonwealth is one of the most precious parts of her legacy, and she was determined her visit would send a message to the rest of the world that South Africa had returned from the political wilderness.
Well, I knew how thrilled she was at a personal level. A big part of this, was Mandela.
The Queen had first met Mandela in 1991, shortly after his release from prison. He'd been invited to attend a Commonwealth Heads of Government conference in Harare as a special guest. As he wasn't yet head of state, Mandela wasn't asked to the formal banquet hosted by the Queen. But unaware of the protocol, he turned up anyway.
Everyone was packing up their cameras, and the aide rushed round and opened the door, and out of this tiny car emerged Nelson Mandela.
Anson had to alert the Queen of his presence before organisers turned him away. It took some quick thinking by the Queen to avoid an embarrassing situation.
And the Queen got the picture straight away and said, yes, bring him over, and also, please find him a place for dinner. And they talked for a long time about sport and how sport is one of the best ways to break down racial barriers.
This first meeting was the beginning of a warm and lasting friendship.
Nelson Mandela was a prince in his Xhosa tribe, so I think he had a very easy way with the Queen, which was perhaps a little less stiff than, say, a Northern European attitude.
When Mandela welcomed the Queen to Cape Town in March 1995, he greeted her like an old friend. Her warm relationship with him gave the trip an added personal resonance.
The Queen came down the gangplank of Britannia and she sets foot on South African soil again, and Nelson Mandela says, "Welcome to South Africa, Your Majesty." That was, over 50 years of absence. Very moving for the Queen.
The South Africa trip was an unparalleled success, with vast swathes of people lining the streets and clamouring for a glimpse of the Queen.
I shall never forget the welcome you have given us. We shall take back in a new form an old message. Faith can move mountains. Faith can recreate a nation.
The Queen's friendship with Mandela would grow and deepen over the course of the decade.
The Queen and Mandela, in my lifetime, represent the best in humanity. And they understood that they did in their interaction with each other.
In the early 90s, the Queen had somehow managed to forge relationships with the most unlikely world leaders: a Republican, a communist, and a freedom fighter. She was riding high on the international stage, but back home, it was a different matter. The collapse of her children's marriages was putting an increasing strain on her as monarch and mother. While the Queen was a resounding success on the international stage in the first half of the 90s, things were far from rosy at home. The public were growing tired of the marital indiscretions of her children, now documented daily in the tabloids.
The problem is if you invite the press to intrude when things are good, you pretty much have to put up with them when things are bad as well.
In March 1992, the Duke and Duchess of York announced their separation, and the next month Princess Anne divorced Captain Mark Phillips. But it was rumours about the marriage of Prince Charles and Diana that proved most troubling. Andrew Neil was editor of the Sunday Times, one of the newspapers pursuing the story.
We had seen more and more stories that there was a serious rift in the marriage between Charles and Diana. So we began to investigate this. We began to see there was something to it.
In June, Andrew Morton's book about Diana was serialised in the Sunday Times. It painted the Wales's marriage as miserable from the start and accused the Queen and the royal family of being uncaring.
This was a story about a woman who was so unhappy that she had attempted suicide, that she had contracted a serious eating disease, that she had affairs herself, that she was accusing her husband of having affairs. And the significance was that for the royal family, for the Queen and Prince Philip, she was the future.
Sir William Heseltine was at the races with the royal family the day after the book was published.
I remember sitting in the back of the box with Diana, who was by this stage in tears, because at that stage she was still denying any hand in the publication of the Morton book, I don't think that it had been a very comfortable lunch for her before we got there.
The idea that Diana might have endorsed the book seemed at the time preposterous.
I couldn't have imagined that she would have had any hand in it at all. I was amazed and distressed when it emerged that she had.
In the months that followed, the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh did all they could to help the Prince and Princess save their marriage.
There was indeed an attempt to reconcile them, most particularly by Prince Philip, who wrote some very good letters to the Princess. What he was trying to do was to hold the marriage together publicly, even if he couldn't hold it together privately.
The Queen, aware incessant speculation about the state of the marriage could seriously damage the monarchy, called on Charles and Diana to take decisive action. On December the 9th, 1992, the Prime Minister, John Major, with the approval of the Queen, announced the separation in Parliament.
It is announced from Buckingham Palace that with regret, the Prince and Princess of Wales have decided to separate. Their Royal Highnesses have no plans to divorce, and their constitutional positions are unaffected.
The statement claimed that despite the separation, it was still constitutionally possible for the Princess to become Queen. Lord Butler, John Major's cabinet secretary, saw it as an attempt to restore public faith in the monarchy.
It was like being in a rough sea. And what was essentially needed was to get into calmer waters and try to avoid some other great blow coming.
The hope was the separation would draw a line under what had been one of the most precarious periods in the Queen's reign.
Endless speculation, if there's any sort of basis of truth in it, is sapping of any institution. So I think there was certainly a point where it was better to say something than to continue to try and hold the line without making much comment.
But the speculation continued, and at the expense of the Queen and the monarchy. In November 1995, Diana secretly recorded an interview with the BBC Panorama programme. It was finally clear the Princess had been behind Andrew Morton's book. In this unprecedented TV interview, she took aim not only at her estranged husband, but many believe also at the Queen.
When Diana made that remark about being Queen of Hearts, she was saying she could be a better queen, and she was actually hitting the Queen at this weak spot of her lack of emotional, outgoing empathy.
This wasn't only a personal attack on the Queen. It shook the very foundations of the monarchy. And the Queen knew there was only one course of action left to take.
After that, the trap went down, and the Queen wrote immediately to Charles and Diana, saying it had gone on too far, too long. They must now divorce.
Days before Christmas, the intention to divorce was announced by Buckingham Palace. The Queen knew it might be damaging to the monarchy in the short term, but it was necessary.
I think by that time it had become felt that it was the lancing of a boil, that this relationship of simple separation couldn't go on, and that therefore, to mix my metaphors, the nettle had to be grasped.
Yet through all the upset, the Queen never let her personal anguish affect her public duties.
Whenever you went to see her about something, however awkward it might be, the story might be embarrassing and difficult, she was always steady.
But those who knew her well say being caught in the middle of a very public and bitter marriage breakdown was far from easy.
Plainly, there were faults on both sides. But it would have been, I think, impossible for her to disregard the fact that one of the parties in this was her son. So I think it was horrible for her.
The non-stop criticism of the press, scrutiny over her finances and debates over the value of the monarchy had taken their toll. But there'd always been one place she could retreat to. Nearly 40 years old, the Royal Yacht Britannia had been her home on the seas for almost her whole reign. She and Prince Philip had designed it as a young married couple in the 1950s.
I name the ship Britannia. I wish success to her and to all who sail in her.
The Queen grew to love the yacht and her life on it. Commodore Tony Morrow was one of Britannia's 11 captains.
This is the anteroom where people would congregate before perhaps a dinner in a small area here, and then afterwards into the drawing room itself. There is a piano here, that was here, played and used by Princess Margaret. Princess Alexandra, I think, also had played the piano here on occasions. It would have been very much the drawing room area where they would sit and just be able to relax after dinner. On the port side, we would see His Royal Highness the Duke of Edinburgh's private study, where he would go and operate. And then on the starboard side here was the Queen's study. Red boxes would come in here, and I think she would have the opportunity of a quiet time, or perhaps discussing the programme of the day or the future programme that was being undertaken by Britannia. People never necessarily really understood that Britannia was very simple. It was described by many as a country home because of the simplicity of it. That was the great hallmark about the beauty of this ship. Nothing was over the top or exaggerated. They wanted that and they created it like that.
But as well as being a home on the seas, Britannia was very much a working ship. The Queen had used it throughout her reign to sail to the farthest reaches of the Commonwealth. Admiral Robert Woodard was commander of Britannia in the early 90s. He recalls some memorable evenings with the Queen and her Commonwealth leaders.
The atmosphere was like a huge family reunion. And the very first and only time I heard Her Majesty interrupted during a speech by jokey heckling. But I remember her saying, do shut up, I'm trying to make a serious point. She was talking to them as family. And it was fabulous.
He also remembers a conversation with the Queen that reveals just how important the yacht was to her.
She said, the only holiday that I truthfully get is in the Royal Yacht, going from Portsmouth the long way round to Aberdeen, taking 2 weeks, when I can get up when I like, I can go to bed when I like, I can eat what I like, I can stop where I like, I can walk where I like, and my time's entirely my own.
But in 1995, this refuge on the seas was under threat. The yacht needed costly repairs, but the furore over the restoration of Windsor had made it clear the public was resistant to paying for the Queen's assets. And so the Conservative government decided it should be decommissioned.
It was thought that it would be too expensive to patch it up and refurbish it and keep it going. And so the alternative was to scrap it and do without it, or to build a new royal yacht.
The Tories proposed that a new yacht should be built and made it part of their election manifesto. But it was a pledge they never got to keep, as New Labour swept to power in a landslide victory in 1997. With an agenda to modernise, giving the Queen a new yacht wasn't part of Tony Blair's plan.
I mean, it was something we inherited, and frankly, at the time, I was new to being Prime Minister. I didn't have a great appreciation of the position of the Royal Yacht. I think if it had happened a few years later, I would probably have reflected a little more before we just implemented the decision.
Less than 6 months after he came to power, the Royal Yacht was decommissioned. In a moving ceremony at Portsmouth, the Queen, her family, and many of those who had served on Britannia bid farewell after nearly 44 years.
It was a huge blow to the Queen, and I felt very, very sad for Her Majesty because, she really, really had loved it as part of her life.
It was a very sad moment for the Queen. It was another home, really. And I think people become very attached to boats, and they become sort of part of you. And obviously, when it had to go, it was very, very sad. And also all the people who served on the ship as well. They had to part with them.
When the Royal Marines Band played Highland Cathedral, it was one of the few times the Queen appeared visibly moved in public.
that was then and now is now, and the times change, frankly. And I always, I felt sorry for her, because in later times I came to know how much she liked it. But I have to say to you, she never complained about it at all, or at least to me.
The Queen had weathered a series of challenging times in the 90s, but the most devastating of all, the death of the Princess of Wales, would take the monarchy to the brink of catastrophe. The 90s had provided a series of dilemmas for the Queen, both privately and publicly. Yet somehow she'd managed to safeguard the monarchy. But one event in August 1997 would present her with the gravest challenge of her whole reign. In the early hours of Sunday, August the 31st, Princess Diana was killed in a car accident in Paris.
The Press Association announced with a news flash at 4:41, that's just a few minutes ago, that Diana, Princess of Wales, has died, according to British sources.
One of the first people the Queen spoke to following the news was the Prime Minister, Tony Blair. He remembers a difficult conversation over how best to deal with the princess's death.
She was trying to work out, as frankly I was trying to work out, how was this best handled, because the perception had been that Princess Diana had been in some way at odds with the monarchy.
The Queen was on holiday in Balmoral with the young princes, William and Harry. She made no public statement and instead focused on consoling them.
I just thought how wonderful they are there, and that the Queen's there to love them and look after them, because they're going to need it.
As the days passed, the public mood grew more and more agitated. But those close to the Queen realized her absence from London was not due to a lack of feeling, but a desire to support her grieving grandsons.
The very idea that she was criticised for not coming to London was ridiculous. I mean, it really was ridiculous, because she was needed where she was.
The days following the princess's death were some of the darkest in the Queen's reign. The institution she had pledged herself to nearly 50 years ago was threatened like never before.
You heard people saying, she's probably out on her horse and shooting, and Prince Philip would probably out killing animals, and it was just crazy stuff. And very little sense of that the boys would be upset, that the Queen was trying to hold it together.
Alistair Campbell remembers walking through the crowds for daily meetings at Buckingham Palace that week.
Look, I knew Diana, but these were people who didn't know her and who were in floods of tears. I've never lived through a revolution, but there was that taste to it.
I really am upset. I can't understand the Queen doing it.
The demand for a public appearance and an expression of grief from the Queen was relentless. 5 days after the princess's death, she returned to London to give the people what they wanted. Her private secretary at the time, Mary Frances, remembers how the atmosphere outside Buckingham Palace changed as soon as the Queen returned.
There was a ripple of applause as her car came along the road, that they were looking at an aging lady who was in the middle of a family tragedy and had come back to do something very difficult.
People, always say, well, was I pressing for this and so on? And the truth is, yes, I thought it was important that the Queen responded to people's feelings, but really in the end, she did it herself.
The Queen doesn't give in to pressure. She does what she wants to do, and rightly. And she realised that, it was important that she did.
The gesture that made the biggest difference was a live broadcast to the nation the day she returned to London.
So what I say to you now, as your Queen and as a grandmother, I say from my heart.
The moment she spoke as a grandmother, and not just as a queen, she demonstrated to the people that she understood their concerns and feelings, and she also explained to them something of her own feelings. So I think, that was the moment, I think, when she brought people back to her.
Many people would argue that this should have happened earlier and she should have come down earlier. But her motivations were undoubtedly absolutely the best. And I'm not going to say she was wrong.
The princess's death marked the climax of almost a decade of challenges for the Queen. Nothing before had demanded such a powerful public statement from her, and nothing would again. In November that same year, there would at last be something to smile about. It was the 50th anniversary of the Queen's marriage to Prince Philip. And it also marked the restoration of Windsor Castle, a 5-year project painstakingly overseen by the Duke for his wife.
He really masterminded the whole of the rebuilding of Windsor after the fire. He was so proud of it all, and how he'd found these people to do these wonderful things to make it back to what it was.
Peter Riddington and Chris Watson were part of the team that undertook the massive restoration project. These original drawings were the first presented to the Duke and Queen for their approval.
These are really incredibly significant at a national level because these are explaining what it is about the buildings, what it is about the different parts of the buildings that are important and how they should be restored and how they would be restored. There was a very positive reaction to the design proposals. It was pretty much just get on with it.
From the beginning, the restoration was a mammoth task, and one that had never been undertaken in Britain before.
We got a lot of people saying, you've got to wait 20 years for it to dry out. We had a lot of people saying, we haven't got any skills now, and we're going to have to go to Russia to get the skills because they know how to do gilding in palaces. But we decided that, collectively, with the royal household and the Duke of Edinburgh, needing to get on with it.
Over the course of the restoration, the Queen and Prince Philip continued to spend weekends in the castle.
Hard hats, boots, and high visibility jackets, even in the 1990s, were still order of the day. And when you've got your monarch turning up on a Friday evening and determined to have a look, I think it was a challenge for them.
We suspect that the Queen went round at weekends and probably didn't wear a hard hat.
Yeah.
The project was already being executed at breakneck speed when the Duke made a special request. He wanted the restoration finished early to host a party to mark his 50th wedding anniversary with the Queen.
It was a challenge. I mean, it was the first time Chris and I fell out. Well, actually, it was the only time we fell out on the project. I had the severest doubts that the grand reception room could be finished in time. And I'm still not entirely convinced that the gilding...
Come, it's perfect.
As a thank you for the dedication and commitment shown, the Queen held a private reception at Windsor for those who'd so lovingly restored the castle.
We'd put back this devastated castle that must have been heartbreaking to see what the damage had been, and it was better than it was before.
I mean, I think it was just the look in her eye. I mean, she was just so excited at that party. You don't really expect the Queen to look excited like that, but goodness, she was so happy, and it was a joy to see.
Next time, the Queen contends with making the monarchy modern again. It's a new millennium with a new Labour Prime Minister promising radical change.
I came to have a real regard for her basic judgment.
She suffers great personal loss with the deaths of her sister and mother.
Suddenly she lost her two best friends.
But revels in a new role as the nation's grandmother. The 1970s had been one of the Queen's most difficult periods on the throne. She'd weathered personal challenges with her sister's divorce and political wrangling over the state of her finances. But the 1980s saw the tables turn. It would be a decade defined by extraordinary highs, but not without its challenges.
Younger royals were becoming celebrities, and that wasn't their role at all. Their role was to support the Queen.
The standout highlight was the wedding of the Queen's eldest son, Prince Charles, to Lady Diana Spencer in July 1981. Close friends of the Queen remember her joy.
I think the Queen was delighted because, I mean, you know, he wasn't all that young, Prince Charles, you know, and it's quite difficult in those days to find somebody that, you know, from a good family like that.
I think the younger generation obviously got very overexcited with a beautiful young couple.
I think we all thought it was perfect. Just the right sort of person.
In all the pomp and circumstance, it's easy to forget this was more than a state occasion. One of the few times when the Queen's public role as monarch and private role as mother were seamlessly combined. It's something Stuart Purvis, one of the producers who